Nature Breakthroughs with Dr. Wild Ben Goldman. Conversations with changemakers in a world gone mad. To discover what you need for personal, organizational, and societal change, get your free download of 3 ancient rituals smart entrepreneurs use to bounce back from shifts in the market and inside themselves. Go to www.naturebreakthroughs.com.
Yes, you pull them till they bite down. On the lies that you built from my doubt. I don't want money, I don't want cars, I just wanna be free.
Enriquez, welcome to Nature Breakthroughs, conversations with change makers in a world gone mad.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for your invitation. I'm very happy to be here talking to you.
The bio you sent me says Enriquez was born in Caracas and lives in New York, where he waits for a sign to cry out. Now and then he talks to the birds, thus perfecting the many ways to spell, "Here I am." It gives a sense of your playfulness, but you're most famous for your tarot reading and your book, Tarology, and there was a movie made about you called Tarology. But today you want to talk about birds, right?
Well, yes, I have been dealing with the tarot for a long time, and it has been a few years now since I'm mostly devoted to the birds. I feel that there is not much more to say about the tarot.
But
so you can talk about anything you want.
Let's start with birds and see where it leads us.
Yeah.
What inspires you? Well, what do you want to say about birds?
Well, I don't know what I want to say, but it all started with this idea precisely. People, I mean, the Tarot de Marseille, the French tarot, which is the one I'm fond of, has this folklore, which is kind of passed through an oral tradition. And at some point I kept hearing the Tarot de Marseille speaks the language of the birds. And people will tell you this as if that was that, right? So I decided that I wanted to know what that meant. And I have spent a long time now trying to figure that out. So eventually you realize that there is this rumor we call the language of the birds that accounts for some sort of original language or universal language, and is linked to some sort of sense of both transcendent from the quotidian or the daily life and finding some sort of sense of unity with the totality of things. So the bird really becomes a metaphor for this elevation that, of course, in many cultures, that is the soul, the spirit, but it's also this desire to go beyond whatever this is. So it has been a long, fun ride, which in the last 4 years takes the form of me talking like a bird, sending messages to people with my bird voice in such a way that they tell me what the bird is telling them. So it's the same thing as reading cards, but in this case, there are no prescriptions. I just deliver a sign and they find the use and the meaning for the sign as they see fit. But I just see it as an extension of the work with the tarot. It's just the same. Everything is the same at the end.
Do you want to give an example? Like use me as a guinea pig? I don't know if that's the right metaphor for birdie. For bird.
I don't know if that is. I think the way it works is that it takes people by surprise. I text these messages to people, so they enter the reality of the person in a moment where they are not expecting it, and therefore become this wedge that tilts reality and reconfigures reality. So maybe
you don't want to surprise us, or you want to do it without.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I think expectation is the enemy of mystery. So the moment that we are we say, let's do this, chances are it's not going to happen.
All right, well, let me, I do these interviews more as conversations than interviews.
Yes, of course.
And I thought, when you say that the tarot speaks the language of the birds, what I think of is, a lot of people think of the tarot as a tool for, let's say, divination, and that means a lot of different things. But, the most common understanding of it would mean some form of prediction, let's say. And birds are fantastic at that. I don't know if you know of the work of John Young and other like bird experts, but back in the day when we lived amongst the birds, the birds are the heralds. They're the ones that tell us what's happening. And
Yes.
you can hear birds can send signals over miles, literally, where humans used to be able to, or some can still, but very few. They'll know when a predator is miles away based upon the bird call. The birds, they're not just chirping. I mean, there's a lot of randomness in what they do, but they're also sending messages like their warnings or their pleadings. They're mating.
Yes.
They're mating. They're signaling the seasons, or they're signaling food sources, or there's all kinds of signaling that they're doing.
Of course, they do have a language. Of course, we have to understand that by the language of the birds, when we apply that or relate that to something like tarot cards, we are really talking about a symbolic bird. It's not nature, it's not ornithology, right? It comes from the logical conclusion that if you see, let's say, vultures circling around, you know that there may be something dead there. And in the past, that could be good news because you can go steal it and eat something, or it could be bad news because there could be something dangerous killing things out there. So we move toward this idea of the bird signaling the reality of the environment, right? Like, as you're saying, I think that the first thing that is really beautiful is this idea that the bird creates its territory by speaking. A bird can go all the way down to South America, come back, and he doesn't need to pee on the trees or scratch the bark. He just sings and therefore opens that space and say, here I am, right? And that here I am is almost like a barcode, because it's not just here I am, it's here I am and I am of this species and this age, and I'm single, or I want to mate, or all the things that are involved in this very simple sound. But I think that the key there is to understand that everything starts with presence. And with the fact that when we show up, we change the configuration of reality. And I mean all the time. So we understand that presence is meaning and presence is performance. There is very little else to do other than be there. But then, of course, we want to extend that a little bit and extend our daily gestures into something that maybe could create a memorable image or something that the other can feed off and find meaning or find inspiration. So eventually we all, as we interact in our daily life with other people, become birds or behave like the birds you are describing. We tell people where the food is, where the good food is, the bad coffee, where we shouldn't be walking that way. And we become these living signs, which is mostly what interests me at this point.
It makes me think of, I forget the word, like, when people talk about like gender, they talk about, present, how you present your gender, let's say, as opposed to how you, the word isn't presentation, it's, anyway, there's a difference between like how you feel and how you show up or how you present, right? And the signaling is in that well, the signaling is presenting in a way. It's not exactly the same as being, right? And
Well, it may be or may not be. I think that in the beginning, we are all transparent and everything is transparent. We don't see things. And actually we walk on the street, we don't notice, you know, the bark of a tree or that little ant moving there, or the person who is crying maybe 2 blocks down. So something has to happen. And maybe that's where that distinction you're doing between being and presenting comes to be. Something has to happen for that which is transparent to become opaque in such a way that we notice it. It's not longer invisible. And that's the moment when we can name it. That's the moment when language comes into the equation. You say, ah, that is that, or, you know, that's a person crying, or that's an ant. Or, I mean, yesterday, for example, I had a headache and I left the house hoping to find some soup. And what I found was a young man riding a motorcycle on the sidewalk in front of my building, and an old man riding a wheelchair on the street. And they were running parallel to each other. They were like racing, but they were not looking at each other. And in a way, I mean, it's hard for something like that to be transparent, mainly because that inversion, right? I mean, if you put the thing that is supposed to be on the street, you put that on the sidewalk, and then the thing that is supposed to be on the sidewalk, you put it on the street, it ceases to be transparent. It gains the opacity that allows to reflect upon it. But I think that when you're talking about presenting, I would like to think that there is a moment when you can connect being and presenting, or what you are and who you are. And it's that moment when you no longer are opaque, but you become translucent. So you change the agency of light. That light is no longer coming from the outside, but it's coming from the inside. And a lot of that for me has to do with, for example, when I go out and talk to the birds, to actual birds, and they respond, I feel that there is something that is gained that I cannot really explain. It's not information in the sense that I can tell you, for example, yes, there is food down the river, or it's time to mate. There is this sense of communication that implies that both the bird and myself, we are inhabiting the same rhythm. And it's a very technical thing. You mimic this sound until you get there. And I think that the knowledge you acquire is more of a sediment. It's something that decants in you and generates this extraordinary sense of joy that if you're lucky, you can irradiate. And it's like, I think it was Erasmus of Rotterdam, the guy who wrote the In Praise of Folly, say that the laughter of the madman in the town square is contagious. You don't know what it is, you don't know why he's laughing, but you just want to laugh with it. So for me, that's the moment of translucency that ends up to be the aspiration.
And you know, one thing I was thinking with birds is they're often, in a way, associated in language with madness. You know, like you're cuckoo, or you know, it's for the birds, or you know, you're flighty, or you know, you're bird-brained. Like
Yeah.
we think we associate birds with like thoughtlessness or you know, to some extent madness, right? So speaking like
Yeah.
a bird is like mad. You're like it's like the Mad Hatter would do, you know.
Well, you know, when I decided a few years back that I wanted to talk like a bird, I mentioned it to a friend, a poet friend of mine, and she was really negative. She said, you will end up sinking into a deeper solitude because we don't know what the birds care about. And I realized that birds care about the same things we care about, which are things that we forget daily, right? And And I do agree with you. I mean, there is something in that desire, which in itself is, again, an extension of presence. It's not only about showing up, but now you show up as a man in New York who speaks like a bird. And I think that when you realize that such aspiration is possible, you learn the laughter of the madman. So,
Also, you know, those are dated phrases, and I think there's been evolution in many people's thinking and being where, you know, kind of connecting and communicating with nature might have been madness in the past, whereas
yes.
now I think people are beginning to appreciate it. So it's a lost skill. It's a urgent, like, human necessity.
Yes, you know, my suspicion when I look at a tree or a flower or a bird, or even the river, right, is that when we look at nature, we wake up from the dream of the cities. I think that there is something in the presence or the experience of nature when we kind of remember that reality is supposed to be something else. And we have built this fantasy of buildings and houses and cars and getting to a tube underground to go somewhere. And it's not real, or it's not as real as that life you are describing. But also, I wanted to say that maybe the reason why we equate birds with madness is just revenge. Birds can fly and we can't. So we say, oh, they're stupid.
And they often sing better than us too.
Yes. Yeah, and there is something.
They seem carefree. They seem to not have worries. It's almost like to not worry is madness.
Of course, yes, yes. The idea that we are not burdened by the imminence of reality, or by all these narratives that we love so much to, you know, inhabit, sounds like madness. That maybe it's a lack of faith in the future, you know, because we are obsessed with being safe. So we do all these things because we're going to be safe, and if we live this way, everything is going to be okay. Of course, that in the long run, we realize it's fiction. I mean, there is nothing safe about anything. But I agree with you that if you stop caring about those things, then by all means and purposes, in terms of relating to other people, you're crazy.
Yeah, and birds also, when you talk about safety, the way they fly is like madness. Like, you would never fly a plane like the way a bird flies around. And,
yes,
you know, it's also magic. I can't believe that a bird could maneuver like that. And
yes, yes. And because a bird can do something that the airplane rarely does, which is change its mind. You can go from here to Frankfurt and halfway say, no, Lisbon. And no, Madrid. But a bird can do whatever he wants, right? And there is something very freeing about that.
freedom, that's the big thing.
Yeah. Yes.
Birds in a way represent freedom, which maybe has an association with madness.
Yes, I like what you're saying, because I agree. I do think that we should aspire to look crazy without being crazy.
I mean, that's part of what I thought of. I was thinking, I can't ask him this stuff, but like, how do you, just you as looking at you as a public figure, let's say, how do you exist as someone who sends bird messages to people? How does that even work? Like I think of that and people would think that's crazy. Like, how does he survive? How does he, how does that work?
But I think that is very important, because one thing that I understood early on is that we need options, and we again, going back to presence and being present in the world also means suggesting that there could be other aspirations, that there could be other things we want. And in my case, it's just I want to communicate in sort of way that in a way that incites responses in people without being prescriptive, but also because I'm in a very specific business, let's say, or I perfect a very specific craft, which is that craft of delivering science. So I work fortune teller for many years, reading cards, right, to people. And that means that they bring their questions or their concerns, and then you tell them something that you see in these images. And at some point you realize, well, what you learn from the cards, it's not just the information you deliver. It's a way of seeing, a way of understanding the relationship between the images, and then the relationship between that relationship and the reality of the person who comes to talk to you. And at some point I realized, but this applies to everything. I can actually look at the world this way. I don't need to rely on the cards. And it comes to a point in which the cards are just too small. And you're always looking down at this table and you're missing. I mean, I always tell the same story. I was giving a reading once, and there was this woman, and they always have this urgency. And I noticed that there was this older guy walking outside, and he looked a little rough, and he kneeled down in a bush or something and picked up a pair of glasses. They were pink, and he looked like a sailor or something. So when he started trying out these pink glasses, it was really weird and beautiful at the same time. But I will see that he was trying the prescription. He was really trying out the glasses to see if he could see with the glasses. And then eventually when he realized, yeah, they work, he pulled a letter from his pocket. It was handwritten letter, and he read it. And of course, at that point, I just stopped the reading, and I invited this woman to look at what was going on, because it was again, it was so opaque, so not transparent. And you wonder, well, which one is the sign? Is the letter that he's trying to read, or the fact that he found the glasses, right? And so at some point I realized the world is bigger than the cards, and it's way more interesting, because there is always the unexpected, or at the very least, that which you are waiting for, the sign, manifest in very unexpected ways. So there is something about waiting in that sense that means that you trust something, chance, let's say. And of course, I find elegance in that. I find elegance in just sit and wait until something shows up. Whether when you use the cards, what you're really doing is to accelerate time. You shuffle the cards and you put them on the table because you don't want to wait. You want chance to appear right now, because in theory, we cannot wait for the answer. Of course, in my experience, it's rare the case when the person couldn't wait a couple of days for the answer, because the urgency is usually about either things that will figure out themselves. Should I order this or that? Should I buy the pants? I mean, people ask that kind of questions. Or it's really about something important that needs time to ferment, to grow. And if we learn to build a relationship with life through these signs that appear, instead of building it through the signs we force into being, then there is a chance that the reflection around the signs could be more productive, or more, at least nourish us in a more complete or in a deeper way.
Beautiful. Another thing I think about when I read your, like that you say, here I am. When I do similar, when I use cards, for example, or when I have worked with people, the question that I feel is kind of almost always, well, the starting point is where am I? You know, not so that's the question. That's often that's often the question, whether people know it or not. They don't know where they are. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Less so even than who I am. You know, as adults, it's more like, well, where am I? Where am I now?
Yes.
They've lost track.
Yeah, I think that's very important, because let's say that we have this idea that in order to know who we are, we have to escape the labyrinth. And when you talk to people, most of them haven't found the labyrinth. They are still not there, right? So the who I am is a question that can be like kind of deferred to the future. We can't answer that one because we don't know where we are, and we're trying to find our way around. And what I find important is that though the answer to that question cannot really come from cards or from something specific, you say. The answer, the answer to the question comes from a relationship with science, literally almost as traffic signs. These things that feed your daily life in such a way that you say, maybe this is the way to go. Maybe that's not the way to go. But it's not just one answer. So when people come to you or they come to me and they want to know, point in the map, where am I right now? It's almost unfair because we can't and we shouldn't say, no, you're just here. What we can say is, well, you're kind of cold or hot. You should veer to the right, to the left, so to speak. But I do believe that it's like a mantic in the sense of divination. That mantic relationship to reality is a dialogue. It's not just one time question and answer.
But somehow the bird song can help answer that question.
Well, I was the first surprised about that. But the first time I recorded myself making a bird sound and I sent it to a friend of mine as a sound message on the phone. She replied right away and she said, thank you. That is exactly what I needed to hear. And that took me by surprise because I didn't know what I was expecting. And actually, most of the time, I don't know what I'm expecting, or I don't expect anything. I just put something out there to see what happens. And then I did it again with another person and then again, and the response was somehow similar. So I kept doing it, and people started to open up and to tell me all these things they thought or they heard in that sound, which that's where I understood, okay, to a certain type of person, because it doesn't work with every person, these can prompt some sort of a state of openness where they let certain thoughts come to be. And it has the advantage to me, and of course, my métier, my job, my craft is to find more elegant way to deliver science. This is not a homework that anybody imposed on me. That's my own pursuit. And I realized I can do this without being prescriptive. I don't have to tell them what to do. I don't have to impose even my own metaphors on them. I don't have to say this means this or that means that. They found the meaning of my sounds without me having to push them in any way. And I find that, within the tradition of the language of the bird that has many aspects, there is this constant idea of using language to go to a place beyond language. And I like that idea that if I can invite people to go to a place outside of language, they can find their way back and find their own language. Because I am convinced that one of our biggest problems is that we are in a crisis of language. And that accounts mainly for the fact that we don't have a language to talk about our inner experience. We have to borrow that language from religion or spirituality or the New Age or psychology. A friend told me the other day, wisely, you talk about inner life, but for most people, inner life is only neurosis. And that may be so, but that is because they borrow language from psychotherapy or whatever that is. And then they explain the reality through that language. So the possibility of some sort of tabula rasa, like taking them out of language so they find their own words, is what I find extraordinarily important in some sort of oracular process. I mean, the idea, I'm fascinated by those old ideas of oracles, and where it's really the opaque voice that presents, as it said, neither conceals nor reveals, just gives signs. So it's not about showing, it's not about not showing, it's about putting something there that the other person can transform and use into the reality.
And I wonder if that sounds so true about the inner language in our world is mostly neurosis. And I wonder how much of that actually is attributed to what we were talking about earlier, which is the disconnect, you know, that we're in this built environment, we're in this language infested, human made, you know, we're separated from nature, we're separated from more natural systems or communications.
Yes, I mean, the thing is that
we're left with neurosis. Like I wonder how many, you know, early peoples were neurotic. Somebody asked me yesterday, how do you find these crazy people? And I felt like everyone seems crazy to me now. Everyone. Like seriously, I almost can't think of a person that I don't think is crazy.
well, I mean, again, that could be a good thing or a bad thing, but I agree with you. Maybe, I mean, there is a disconnection with some sort of ground that we forgot. But at the same time, I do think that it's very important not to generate the sense that, well, we all have to live a pastoral life. We have to go to the mountains, you know, and start, I don't know, raising goats, and because otherwise there is no life to be lived. I think that there is also beauty in the cities, and of course there is nature in the cities. I mostly talk to sparrows, which are probably the most boring bird in the world. It's tiny, brown, and only chirps like in these little drops of water, right? I mean, there are so many birds that are cooler than that, but I love sparrows. And I talk to them because those are the ones who live around my block. So I do think that I find that all the time, that there are people who feel that they need to take a long trip or go to an exotic place to have an experience. I find that I mean, I just stepped out of my house yesterday and there was an old man riding a wheelchair on the street. And maybe if you're lucky, but especially if you slow down, I think those things appear everywhere, which of course to me has to do with the other side of the equation of having a crisis of language. And it's that to me, any crisis of language is founded on a disconnection to poetry. And by poetry, I don't mean that people have to write sonnets or, you know, start speaking in rhymes. I mean this idea of claiming the world by naming it. The idea that you can actually look at something and say, this is this to me. I'm fascinated by this waitress. I go always to the same cafe, and one of the youngest, newest waitress, I heard her the other day, some woman asked her, what is a croissant? And she said, it is the bread that looks like a shrimp.
Oh.
And I really thought, I want for this woman to show me everything. Let's go out and name everything. And that's what I mean. I think that ability to bring through language the images we carry within ourselves, without that having to be a diagnosis of our mental state or an account of our, you know, for a lot of people nowadays, their pain, their trauma, whatever that is some sort of Sistine Chapel. They are so proud. They have been working all their life in this masterpiece, which is just pain. And maybe for the rest of us, it's not such a beautiful masterpiece. Maybe old pain is old pain. And we have to find not only other ways to talk about it, but also other things to talk about.
You sent me a text that you asked me to read about, I forgot what it was called, but it was about your interest in birds. And it was mostly people's responses, I believe, to your sending them these bird messages.
Yes.
And there were hundreds of them. It went on for pages and pages and pages. There were hundreds. And I just was, well, it amazes me that there are that many people that have that kind of ability to respond to you in that way. Like, who are these people that can get a bird song and then find so much meaning in it? I think of the people that I know, I almost can't think of anyone that would have a response to it that would be so enlightening like all of those responses were. Did you train them in how to listen to the bird, or was this, what happened?
Well, no, I didn't train them in how to listen to the birds, but most of those people are people who have taken lessons with me in how to read the cards. So we have worked with the tarot, and there is a certain kind of people who take lessons, and when they're done, they say goodbye, and that's that. And then there are the others that stay with me. And then we develop friendships, and we have communication, and we talk about poetry or about the things I saw or the things they saw. And a lot of the people in that document are those people, the people who somehow we have a dialogue, so they are willing to play. But then there are the other people that I just met, and even sometimes people I don't know, they write to me, they ask me a question, and very often I just send a bird message just to see, in a way, are they on this side, on the other side? Can they deal with this in some interesting way, or are they, I remember one time a woman told me, I have no time for cryptic messages. And I realized that's fine, I just don't have time for you. I only have time for people who have time for cryptic messages, or at the very least to entertain some sort of mystery in life.
Told her that with a bird song, I hope.
But yeah, it's a very diverse group of people. There are old people, young people, people from all over the world, people who are tarot readers, people who are doctors, philosophers, teachers, magicians. So it is a really diverse crowd. But I'm very happy about that document, because again, it's like, okay, this sounds impossible, but it isn't.
It's proof, what do they call it in business? Proof of concept that it works. But, and I know you don't want to force it, but I wish there was some way to demonstrate what you're talking about while we're doing this podcast. But I feel like if I ask you,
well, but I will say this: I can send a little message, but maybe instead of you trying to come up with an answer, because it's a weird thing to put you on the spot, right? Maybe this is not a message for you, but it's a message for someone who will listen to this podcast.
Okay.
And maybe if they feel so compelled, they could just write a comment eventually about what they heard.
That would
Okay.
be, yeah.
Well, let's try.
And I don't mind being put on the spot. I've signed up for that by being here.
Okay, let's see. So maybe at some point someone will hear something.
And just one comment I would make is, I feel like the technology mediated that and may have, how it sometimes cuts out sounds that are in the background, from the background. So I don't know if some of those sounds were so soft that they were barely audible, or if that was Zoom doing that.
It could be because when I was doing it, I heard some feedback. So who knows what that was at the end. But also those are the limits of, I mean, usually I'm on the street and I record with the iPhone, and usually it's my daughter who makes the videos.
Yeah.
And of course, now I have a different appreciation for the sounds of the city, because we think that maybe there is a quiet street or something, and eventually we realize, no, it's not. There is a compressor, there is this thing sounding, there is a truck. So we are always looking for a red light, so the traffic stop, and maybe somebody is no longer speaking. But we will see. We will see what happens.
Well, I mean, things I can say is, of course, it sounded like a bird. You know, that's for one. And then I also wonder, is it a bird? Like, is there a,
Good. Yes.
or is it?
I think,
a
well,
generic-
yes, that's a great question, because I hope I don't forget the two things I want to say. So let's start with one. And it's the idea of bird. So I do spend a long time talking to the birds, which is the only way to learn the language. So I mimic them. And if you do so, you understand overall the rhythm, because the chirp is one thing, but then it's the space in between chirps and how they do that and how they hold certain patterns, right? So at some point I realized it's not really about being ornithologically sound, because and a lot of people have that mind when they need to name the bird, and I don't, or at least I gave up in that desire a while ago. I don't need to know which bird is which. As long as the bird speaks, I'm there. But so that is one thing. And now, of course, I forgot the second one. But it will come. I mean, I do think that it's very important to move away from information in a way. So it's not, is that an Oriole? Is that a cardinal? Is that they come here only in this time of the year? They do that. The other thing exactly is that as I do this thing, I get a lot of messages from people who will say, because of you, now I listen to the birds, which is very nice. And I realize it's after some time that they don't mean the ornithological bird. They don't mean the scientific bird. They are listening to the symbolic bird. And by that, I mean that they don't expect to know anything scientific about the bird. They are really listening to the birds in the hope for a message. And it's very different, because then you realize they are completely engaged, but maybe they are only engaged out of selfishness. They are engaged because maybe there was something for them. But even so, there is something beautiful about that. You know, it's like, for example, in the old rules of ornithomancy, of actually looking up the sky and reading messages, you have these rules that say, well, if the bird shows up on your right, that means a good message. Yes. If the bird shows on your left, it's a bad message, or a no. And I don't particularly like that much, but I do understand that it's very useful to help people pay attention. Because if you just say, pay attention, what does that mean? How do we do that? But if you start giving people coordinates for them to look at something specific, they can actually find their way around that. So I find it very useful when I tell that to people, and then they are looking for birds all the time and trying to figure out, is this coming this way, that way? Eventually, you realize that what you're gaining really is the ability to look at things. It's not the answer to a specific question. So tell me about your relationship with birds, if there is any.
Well, one thing I've felt lately is when I listen to birds, I feel, well, I notice the kind of ornithological inclination of wanting to know what bird that is. But I have this feeling of loss that I used to know. but I no longer know. Like that, or the opposite thing will happen is I'll hear a bird and I'll know the bird. And it's like, how do I know that? How do I know what that bird looks like and its name? Like, but I know it. And then there are other birds which are very familiar, but I don't know what it looks like. And, you know, the other thing about birds is I listen to the birds, but I can't see them, you know, no matter how hard I try. Like, I'm not a birder. I don't have the tools.
Yes.
I don't go out birding, but I love to listen to them. And
Well,
then
yes. Yeah.
one other
Please.
thing I wanted to say is that I once went like on a little nature tour, and the guide was also very good at bird calling, but his attitude was that it was dangerous to the birds to do it. So he didn't do it. Like, he showed us he could do it, I think, before we went into the woods, but
Yes.
when he was in the woods, or he might have done it, but he made a point not to do it because it confused the birds, or it stressed them out. You know, there was some issue with him doing it, and he didn't want to, so he didn't do
Yes.
it. And I don't know if you've heard of that. And it may not
No.
apply to sparrows in the city, but
Well, I think it is different. Something I have learned is that we can't talk about the birds as an abstraction, because birds are actually individuals. So you have birds that actually want to engage, and some birds who don't or can't. And in a situation, I mean, let's say, for example, that I'm sitting at my cafe, my coffee place, and a sparrow comes and sit on the table. Well, I'm going to talk to it, right? And usually, if some of them want to speak, some of them don't. Or, for example, if I'm walking by this garden that we have nearby, I will speak to the robins, and some of them actually come closer and closer and closer. And the funny thing is that if they are on the ground, they don't speak. They just move toward me and they come to check me out. If they are up the trees, they respond. And you can have long conversations with them, and they have this beautiful sound that is almost like somebody juggling or something. It always goes and comes back. And it only happens when they are safe up there. When they are down on the ground, they are trying to figure out, there is a whole other language, right? And actually there is a beautiful movie by Pier Paolo Pasolini, which is in English, I think it's called The Hawk and the Sparrow. And it's a movie from the 60s where there is a father and a son that are going on an errand, and I don't remember now what they want to accomplish. And they come across this crow, maybe it's a raven.
they come across what?
A raven.
A raven.
That speaks to them. And he tells them the story of Saint Francis, and how Saint Francis sent these two monks to learn the language of the hawks and the language of the sparrows. And I mean, in a way, it's a beautiful movie. It's a little funny too, because then you see these guys, you know, they spend a year standing there like a tree to learn the language of the hawks, and finally they get it, and they get screeched like hawks. So they go back and say, yes, we accomplished that, and we're so happy. And then San Francisco say, no, but now you have to go learn the language of the sparrows. And they do the same thing. And after a year, they know the language, but the sparrows don't answer. And it takes a while for one of these monks to realize that they speak in a language of gestures, that when they are on the ground, they move in a certain way, and that signifies things. And that reminded me that the first time I asked an ornithologist, an actual scientist, about the language of the birds, he didn't speak to me about song or singing, or it was all about body posture and movement on the ground, how they signify things just by the way they shift and they move. And I mean, I grew up with horses, and I would say that everything I know about people I learned from horses. And it has to do with this thing where you see the animal moving, you see them shifting their mood, gesturing and posturing, obviously without words, and you know what's going on. I mean, after a while, you know, I better not get close, or now it's safe, or I should do this. So I do think that it's very important to understand those two different languages, which in the tradition of the language of the birds, let's say that a lot of that tradition has to do with wordplay or playing with words and anagrams and puns and all this. It also has to do with the hieroglyphic aspect of letters. The idea that you look at the form of a letter and you realize, it looks like a mountain, or it looks like water, or it looks like a pool, or, and finding messages there. So there is in that sense, a connection to alchemy in the European 1600 sense of alchemy, where you talk about the possibility of a mute book, the mutus liber, the idea that you can look at a book without words and understand what's going on. And of course, they translate that into the cathedrals and the buildings, and this idea that you can read buildings as you will read a book if you just look at the actions, the figures. I mean, that is how I read tarot cards. It all comes from the same place. It's this idea that you are reading the images. I mean, the meaning doesn't come from some sort of consensus of a symbolic nature. The meaning comes from an experience of your own body that allows you to understand what's going on there. And it's very freeing, but again, it's something that once you understand in one aspect, in the cards, so to speak, you can apply to anything. You can look at that, and it happens. You know, I do think that when people talk about mind reading as if it is such a big feat, but if you really pay attention and you look at someone, you know if they are engaged or they are not engaged, if they are liking what you're saying, if they are not liking it, if you're making them uncomfortable, if you're putting them at ease. You may not be able to guess the plate numbers of their car, you know, like a magician, but you know what's going on. And I think it's all the same language.
Interesting. Something else occurred to me, which is, well, so I guess sparrow and a lot of these birds have deep symbolic associations, right? Like religious and things like that. And one thing you said, what's my relationship to birds? And it just occurred to me while you're talking, which was, I haven't been to many funerals in my life, but one of the first funerals I went to was a lady who had worked for my grandmother for years and years and years. And she lived in Harlem, and the chorus there in this Harlem church, they sung a song, I think it's called like The Eyes of the Sparrow or something, or His Eyes Are on the Sparrow. Do you know this song? It's
no.
Some Christian or Black gospel song. And oh my God, it just is the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. I think it's His Eyes Are on the Sparrow, something like that. It's all about the sparrows. I was like, yes. I want that sung at my funeral, but of course it wouldn't be as good. I've tried to find the music, and I've even found fabulous singers and stuff who've sung it, but nothing sounded like that.
That sounds extraordinary. Yeah, well, I guess with symbolism, we can go back to names, right? Because names are also symbols. And you have, for example, somebody like Michael McClure, the poet, who would say, you have to know the names of all the birds, right? Or Gary Snyder would say, in order to be a poet, you have to know the names of things, animals, birds, plants, and also magic. Tarot astrology is something, right? And I find that, of course, that is beautiful, right? It's beautiful to to aim to know the names of things is a beautiful pursuit. At the same time, if you call the birds by their names, they don't believe you. It means nothing to them. So there is this funny thing where, I mean, the other day I was talking to a friend of mine who actually works with raptors. And she told me, I thought this was wonderful because she's Greek, or her family's come from Greece. And she was telling me that she's sick and tired of Greek myths, because usually what we receive here as a Greek myth is some sort of German or British concoction that has nothing to do with the actual thing. And then to dispel a myth for me, she told me that the owls, which are in the Greek mythology, the symbol of wisdom, she say owls have these huge eyes that take the entire space of the skull. So they end up having a really tiny brain, and they are absolutely stupid. So they are the dumbest bird of prey, she said. And they only move by instinct. So they are very dangerous, because if you move in a strange way, you could recognize a pattern that makes him pounce, and he doesn't know what he's bouncing at. Right? And I found really beautiful that a Greek dispeller of Greek myths came to tell me that the owl is not really a symbol of wisdom. So I think those things are interesting. At the same time, I with everything, tarot cards, any kind of magic or mystery, I think when you face mystery, you realize that you have two ways to go. Either you go for the myth, or you go for the experience. And there are people who really love the myths. I mean, there are people who want to be told stories about these things. Even about the cards, for example, they want to be told the story of the tower and why the tower is the way it is, and why is these people falling down. And then I think I'm on the other side, where I'm looking for the experience. I'm looking for the raw experience these things produce in me and in other people that I share them with, and an experience that then demands for language to be created in the moment. And it's no longer about the myth of what so and so said about this thing. Is what was happening here and the way we see it and what we say.
I mean, the names are, of course, always arbitrary. And in fact, I think there's a book that's something like birds or fish. So it's something like that actually there's no difference between a bird and a fish, physiologic. It's something like that. There's a book about taxonomy, or about how animals are categorized, and apparently it's not at all as clear as what people think. I think it's titled something like Birds or Fish, something like that. And it's a recent book.
Well, I like that because in a way, if you think about it, the fish and birds move in a similar way. I mean, fish fly under the water, right? And birds are swimming up there. So there, I mean, I don't know.
It's useful to name things, and it's useful to make these distinctions.
Well, of course,
it has utility, but there's difference between utility and poetry, and
yes.
Stories, of course, stories have utility.
Well, and I agree. I think that names are meeting points. If we name something, we know we're talking probably about the same thing. But of course, every name gives us like shade. So we put it on top of the object, and we know we can kind of meet there under the shade of the name. And that is very useful and comforting until we feel that we need to go out play in the sun, right? I mean, there is a moment when we realize, oh, but this thing that I'm naming this way is not only that which is covered by the name. There are other facets, other angles that maybe require other names. And that game is, I guess that is the game of poetry, but also it's a game that goes toward the expansion of our mind, understanding that things are not closed off, but things could become something else, or could be seen in a different light.
Well, this was this was fun. And oh, I know another thing I want to say is that birds are light, right? That's another thing about birds. Oh, I want to tell you one other thing. You asked me about my experience. Last week after we agreed to talk, I noticed that on my morning walk with the dog, these birds would attack me in this one park. And it happened several times. And there were other people there, and they weren't attacking anyone else, but they would fly up and they were attacking me for some reason. So I thought that was interesting.
Yes, it is. It's very, I mean, I wonder in any case why they weren't attacking other people.
I don't know. Or they weren't attacking my dog. They were just coming at me.
And were they big birds or?
No, but they weren't sparrows or anything like that. They were, I don't know what they were. They were, I don't know what kind of bird they were. They weren't a bird that I know the name of. Well, I might, but I didn't, I've forgotten. It happened
No.
for a child too. I remember we had a martin house, you know, for martins. And at one point, my brothers and I discovered that if they called out my name, Ben, the birds would attack. So they used to always yell Ben, and then the martins would dive bomb and try to get us.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Something about that.
So you have a name that attracts the birds.
Well, I don't think they like it. Yeah,
Well, but maybe you have a tasty name
the taste,
and they are trying to eat it.
maybe.
Of course, can you eat the name without eating the person? I don't know.
I don't know, but it seemed more like that they saw me as a threat. That's how I felt. But this was fun. And I wanted to say the lightness of the bird. I don't know if that has, I don't want to necessarily bring that back to madness, but that's another key. I think that's so important that that it's like being,
But I love that you,
hold them lightly. You have to treat them lightly. There's a lightness to birds, unlike almost any other creature other than maybe insects.
yes. But I love that you brought the idea of madness. I do think that we all have the right to claim our own madness. And yeah, and maybe as you said before, there is a lightness in madness that has to do with being unburdened by a certain aspect of daily life. But maybe that lightness, I mean, it will be great if through some sort of madness, we could turn our bones hollow, like bird bones, so we can kind of float a little bit. And that would be lovely.
We have to lose the marrow.
Yes, exactly. And let the air in.
Well, so how would people reach you if they wanted to hear your bird song or learn more about how to
Well,
or
I
to
guess the easiest way would be Facebook. If they
how do
message me.
how do they find you on Facebook?
Well, they put my name and
Okay,
usually I show up.
you're the only Enriquez.
Well, no, I don't think so, but you will see me and you will know it's me,
Okay,
and my profile is open, so you will see me talking like a bird or something. And then people could send me a private message and I always answer. I always answer to every single person who writes to me. So I think that will be the easiest way.
and they can find your book on Amazon or whatever, Tarology.
Yes.
And you have
I have, yes, on Amazon you have Tarology, which is a book about the poetics of tarot cards. And you have a book of interviews with tarot people. And also another book, which is a book of wordplay and things that are related to everything we're talking about, but not applied to cards, but to language. But again, if you look me up on Amazon, you will find my books. And I think that if you go on Amazon Prime, you can see the documentary Tarology, which is a documentary that filmmaker Chris DeLeo did about my work with tarot cards, actually 10 years ago.
and it's a beautiful film. It's worth
Well,
seeing.
thank you. So I know that that one is on Amazon Prime.
And you have a new little book called Beautiful. I don't know if they'll delete me, but the second word is a curse word that is abbreviated BS. So it's Beautiful BS. And it's about, well, it's rooted in tarot, right?
Yeah, I think it's still maybe those are actually essays I wrote maybe 5 years ago. I sent them to a friend and I forgot that I wrote them. So a month ago or so, we were talking and he said, well, why don't you? I was giving some lectures and they say, you have to have lecture notes. And I didn't want to do that. But then they say, well, why don't you publish this? And he sent this thing back to me and I read them and said, I like this. I didn't know that I wrote this. And they are somehow transitional in the sense that you have my favorite essay about the tarot that I have written, but mostly it's almost like post-cartomancy. There are things there where I describe, for example, reading the cards that a woman found on the street and building an entire relationship with this woman because she now and then found a playing card on the sidewalk. So we did this years-long reading in which you will find one card and you'll have a piece of something that you have to wait for a month or two to get the next one. So I think the essays on this little booklet account for that movement out of the table. It's no longer about reading cards to people, but it's about engaging with the cards in reality to generate some sort of shift that eventually end up with me getting rid of the cards and just chirping.
Well, thank you. And I also wanted to ask you about Venezuela, but that I think will have to be for another conversation. So I hope we stay in touch. And
please, I enjoy this immensely, Ben. Thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Nature Breakthroughs podcast with Dr. Wild Ben Goldman to discover what you need for personal, organizational, and societal change. Get your free download of 3 ancient rituals smart entrepreneurs use to bounce back from shifts in the market and inside themselves. Go to www.naturebreakthroughs.com.